Now, as advertised, we're going to talk about the ongoing 78th United Nations General Assembly in New York, where 8 hours or so ago, President Tinubu delivered his first address to the General Assembly, highlighting a variety of issues. And of course, his theme was centered around rebuilding trust, or rather the theme of the General Assembly is around rebuilding trust and reigniting global solidarity, accelerating action on the 2030 agenda and its sustainable development goals towards peace, prosperity, progress, and sustainability for all. So before we get down to unpacking the president's speech, let's hear from the horse's mouth what President Tinubu said to the United Nations General Assembly on developing issues here in Nigeria, across the continent, and indeed his perspective of what is happening on the global stage. Here's a highlight.
There are 5 points I want to highlight. First, if this year's theme is to have any importance at all and any impact, global institutions, other nations, and their private sector actors must see Africa as a development priority, not just for Africa, but in the interest of us all as well. Due to both long-standing internal and external factors, Nigerians and Africa's economic structures have been skewed to impede development, industrial expansion, job creation, and the equitable distribution of wealth. If Nigeria is to fulfill its duty to its people, and the rest of Africa, we must create jobs and the belief in a better future for our people. We are pushing for that. We must also lead by example. Second, we must affirm democratic governance as the best guarantor of sovereign will and well-being of the people. Military coups are wrong, as in any titled civilian political arrangement that is, will perpetuate injustice. The wave-crossing part of Africa does not demonstrate favor towards coup. It is a demand for solution to perennial problem. This brings me to my third crucial point. Our entire region is locked in protracted battle against violent extremists. In the turmoil, a dark channel of inhuman commerce has formed. Along the route, everything is for sale. Men, women, and children are seen as chattel. Yet, thousands reach the Sahara, hot and sand, and the Mediterranean cold death in search of a better life. At the same time, mercenaries and extremists with their lethal weapons and vile ideologies invade our region from the north. This harmful traffic undermines the peace and stability of the entire region. African nation will improve our economics so that our people do not risk their life to sweep the floors and streets of other nations. We also shall devote ourselves to disbanding extremist groups on our turf. The fourth important aspect of this global trust and solidarity is to secure the continent's mineral-rich areas from plundering and conflicts. Many such areas have become catacombs of misery and exploitation. The Democratic Republic of Congo has suffered this for decades, despite the strong UN presence there. What happened? The world economy owes the Republic of Congo much, but gives her very little. the mayhem visited on resource-rich areas does not respect national boundaries. Sudan, Mali, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, and the list grow on and on and on. The problem also knocks at Nigerians' door. Fifth, climate change severely impacts Nigeria and Africa. Northern Nigeria is honored by desert encroachment, handed from the north. All are arable lands. Our south is pounded by the rising tide of coastal flooding and erosion. In the middle, the rainy season brings flood that kill and displace multitudes.
Well, that was the highlight of President Tinubu's speech at the United Nations 78th General Assembly in New York, covering a variety of issues around security, democracy, agriculture, environment, and a host of other issues. Now, let's try and unpack what the 78th General Assembly is themed after, and also what the President had to say to the rest of the world during that assembly. Join us on the program is Ambassador Haruna Warkani, who is a diplomat and an international affairs analyst. I think we've gotten around to, the perfect title for Mr. Warkani's contribution. As always, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us on Daybreak. It's good to see you again.
Morning viewers.
Right. First of all, let me start with your thoughts and impression of the President's first appearance at the United Nations General Assembly. And what do you make of his speech?
Well, Nigeria, we would say thank God that the President has made his first speech. And making this first speech, he's been able to draw attention to the few things like the themes he has chosen to address, which includes the reigniting shared humanity and issues of security, climate change, and usually those common threads in human interactions today. He has also spoken more as Africa's president rather than Nigeria, which is significant. We would say for the first time in so many years, Nigeria perhaps is beginning to assert its rightful position as a giant of Africa, and therefore rightfully speaking for and on behalf of Africa. I think it's significant because it might be lost on people, but these are important things that he has clearly shown, and therefore one would say the speech represents both Ecowas and Africa, beside being for Nigeria, which ordinarily this is an auspicious event that allows countries to air their views on world affairs once in a year at such a gathering. And so Bola Tinubu has shown that he is capable as a president by delivering such a speech,
right,
and has touched on the key sectors of the global economy that requires attention. Right. Usually it is a period of pleading that each country comes along with to say, okay, for us in our small sovereign state, these are the issues which we want to bring to the fore for the international community to recognize, accept, and perhaps act upon, which he has successfully done.
Yeah. There's one particular part of that, just before we move on from the point around speaking for Africa, where he said, we are not asking for identical programs and actions. We seek, or what we seek as an African, as Africans or as a continent, is an equally firm commitment to partnership. We seek to enhance international cooperation with African nations to achieve 2030 agenda and sustainable development goals. The word equal there is something that has been re-echoed by many African leaders in the past around how the rest of the world sees Africa. Do you think that that is something that is achievable beyond just the rhetorics of it, beyond just, you know, saying it? Do you think that the rest of the world, or the rest of the global West, for instance, sees Africa as an equal partner?
Well, equality, maybe no. But let us not forget that this 5 to 25 minutes maximum speech period is the only time in the United Nations setting that allows countries to exercise a feeling of equality. Every country is sovereign and equal before the United Nations General Assembly at that moment. And so America, as big as it is, or Russia, China, Japan, or wherever, they are still given the same minutes to address the General Assembly. And so you will expect that, yes, at that moment, everyone will want to feel equal. The equality, however, ceases immediately after the speech.
Right.
Yes.
And that's very telling, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's very, very telling, because immediately after this speech, the issue of equality does not exist anymore. The developed West will carry on business as usual. And this business means competition. And such competition means fierce competition for the scarce resources of the world. And therefore, whoever accesses God is not anybody's problem. What they want is to develop their countries. If you are unable to balance yourself and confront this challenge, well, that's left to you as a sovereign country. And so, equality may be just a concept, but not a practice. I think that is the...
Just to feed into these questions, to further vitalize it for people to get proper perspective. When you listen to the president and to other African presidents, for instance, Ramaphosa, do you get a sense of people being ready to walk their talk? You want to be treated equally. Tomorrow, India comes calling and says, India-Africa Summit, and then you load 54 of you into a coaster bus and go and sit down with just one leader. Then the next day, Russia comes calling. You pack yourself in another air molue and go and sit with them, and then France come calling. And you would have stumbled on President Ruto's position on these issues, and how we cannot just be ordering us around in the coastal civilian buses and telling you are danger to us. How do we begin to walk back some of these things that we ask of the UN General Assembly, beside the rhetorics, as Abdullah talked about?
Well, I think the rhetorics is beginning to be like a lesson for the larger leadership composition in Africa. It's a wake-up call. Leaders are beginning to realize that, okay, if one of them, like Ruto rightly said, they cannot be put in a coaster bus like school children. It has woken, I think, some consciousness in African leaders to say, oh boy, wait. Truly, we should not be addressed as if we are nobody. Right. You cannot negotiate for and on behalf of 50 African countries. Each has a different agenda, each has a different perspective, development challenges, and what have you. So how has it come that you gather everybody and say is like this? Going back to Tinubu's speech, you will realize that he was referring to the Marshall Plan after the Second World War, where Europe and America decided that, look, for us to rebuild the devastated countries as a result of the World War, there was some significant affirmative action that needs to be taken. You cannot continue developing by the same method. That is to say, was a global state of emergency declared by the developed West, let us say. Now, what the president has said is we are not asking for that kind of affirmative action, but we are asking for like an affirmative partnership. Now, affirmative partnership, like we said in the opening, might not come because partnership is like joint venture. Joint venture cannot work most times because each party going into such a marriage has perhaps diametrically opposed goals. And so most times, immediately after the journey starts, you begin to see issues that were not foreseen. Now, Africa's partnership with the rest of the world is such that you have areas of economy, you have areas of security, physical development, social development, that is very difficult to manage. Europe might have forgotten some of these things because they have crossed that Rubicon, and therefore it's no longer their concern. If we go now knocking and say we want a partnership to develop socially, for instance, it sounds strange because European countries, socially, education and the rest of them, they have finished. They have finished. So we are operating on different pedestals, and therefore there is already an inbuilt conflict in all this relationship.
Right. There seems to be this particular issue when he was talking about, this particular region locked in a protracted battle against violence extremists for 10 years. And he did talk about how the illicit flow of arms has continued unabated in this part of the continent, destabilizing the region. And we all know the ones that are the countries that these weapons come from, your Russia, your France, and all these other countries that the president was addressing. Do you think there's an honesty in the conversation that goes on during the General Assembly, or is everyone just saying the things he feels like saying to make himself feel better, but at the end of the day, nothing changes?
Well, like I said earlier, there is so much distrust, so much competition, and self-centeredness of nations, such that the real issues of humanity are set aside. It is more or less like a shame that the United Nations, 78 years thereafter, just the General Assembly, we are still grappling with basic human issues. Ordinarily, the world should have asked the question, what is really happening? We shouldn't be here. Humanity should have moved ahead. But unfortunately, we are still here talking about the same issues of human development. Now, the honesty of nations is something that the more you get to know what happens, particularly behind the scene, the more angry you get with humanity itself. For instance, the flow, illicit or not illicit, just flow of arms around the world is such that at a point in time, the United Nations says, okay, let the arms producing nations come together and agree on some protocols of how arms should be sold. America, for instance, refused to accede to that protocol, which is called the Wassenaar Agreement. They refused to say arms is a legitimate product based on the Second Amendment. The First Amendment in the Constitution.
The American Constitution.
Very good. So they have refused to even be party to that protocol. And therefore, you cannot question America for selling arms to anybody. Other countries have followed suit to say, okay, if America refuses, why will we compel ourselves? And so you see, the international relations have become so complex. So whoever is the receiving country, you are on your own. And therefore, our region here in Africa, definitely we are on our own. We need to wake up and help ourselves rather than expecting anything to come from outside.
We've had some memorable speeches in the General Assembly. Your Gaddafi tearing up the declaration and things like that.
Yes.
A lot of people can resonate with that sort of anger because when you hear speeches like this, they're glossing over the issue. Nobody's trying to call out who is responsible for what and things like that. Everybody is trying to be nice to each other, except if there is a common enemy. In this case, Russia was being picked on for the most part, especially with regards to what's going on in Ukraine. What does that lack of sincerity and honesty in calling a spade in this entire conversation that makes this whole thing a charade in the eyes of most people?
Well, sincerely, it is. We can't remove that word charade from the entire exercise, because if you bring nations and say, okay, you are allotted 5 to 25 minutes maximum, come and tell us what you feel about the world and what have you. Yes, Mugabe, Gaddafi, Netanyahu, and the rest of them have shown what it means sometimes to be there. And when they take the stage, you can see that they have set protocol aside and went ahead to do what they believe as leaders then. And that's why sometimes it is usually good to have leaders that are eloquent enough to be able to convey your own feelings to the entire world. It's a 15 minutes representation of your concerns. Each nation has a different concern. And since, like I said, it's a competition, people are not likely to agree. But the United Nations itself, unfortunately, has failed. Has failed to coordinate. Because after the speeches, what happens?
Yeah, I was about to ask the question, who is taking notes? Right.
That's it. So the fact that after the speeches, nobody follows up, it means everybody comes into a wardrobe and hangs his used clothes and goes home. Nothing happens thereafter. Next year, by this time, we will expect leaders to come back and either repeat themselves
right.
or if they have new ideas or new members coming as we have today, well, they may come and be excited to say new things and what have you. But the truth is, the United Nations is unable to coordinate the affairs of this world the way people generally will want. Otherwise, by now, hunger and some extreme forms of poverty should have disappeared on the face of this earth, because we have more than enough to take care of everybody. It is more about distribution and equitable access to some of these resources of the world. So if some nations believe they have enough and they don't care, some others do not have, and you do not actually care. See, there were times when America played a kind of diplomacy with wheat. They've produced so much wheat domestically that they didn't know where to take it to. People were crying in some countries of hunger. Give us this wheat. They say no. They rather dumped it into the ocean to enable their farmers produce more, having paid insurance. And they will tell nations not to even produce by saying, don't give subsidy to your farmers.
I think Canada is doing something similar with milk, for instance.
So now, you can see how unjust the world itself is. And so, for us as African leaders, it is not enough to go and grandstand at the United Nations annually. No. From here, we need to sit down and work out what is feasible for us as a people, so that the welfare of our people is first and foremost. Nobody is coming from New York or anywhere in the face of this earth to come and help us here. Mr. President raised the issue of coastal flooding and erosion, desertification in the north, and general flooding in the middle belt, for instance. This is Nigeria's problem. Nobody is coming here to say, Mr. President, you came to the United Nations and you said you have coastal erosion. We were here to help you. No. It is for us as a nation to sit down and say, okay, gentlemen, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of that, MDA, whatever, what do we really do? It is not beyond us to tackle these issues. Desertification, since the enactment of the Green Belt, how many trees have we really planted? It's our own problem. It's our own environment. Right. It's partly our money, because even when they bring foreign funding, they ask you to bring counterpart funding. Sometimes the counterpart funding becomes criminally more than the actual fund that is coming. And at the end of the day, you see that you are paying people huge salaries and allowances that should have gone into the project itself.
Right.
Good. So it is more or less a loss to us for adopting some of these programs. And it's quite a problem.
For a diplomat, it's almost as if you're saying the United Nations is not fit for purpose, regarding current issues.
Well, almost. That is the reality, because if it is, like I said, some of this poverty we see,
Yeah.
criminal poverty, I will call it,
Right.
we shouldn't be there.
And let's unpack that, because a significant part of the agenda is about sustainability for all.
Yeah.
If you look at the long theme, at the end of the day, it says sustainability for all, and I think that's the most significant part of that theme. And it talks about the SDGs and how we're missing the target. 2030 is just 7 years down the line. What are your thoughts about the lack of implementation and how a significant part of the world is not necessarily on track to meet the 2030 agenda?
Well, the SDGs were fantastic programs when they were rolled out. Globally, it was accepted as a panacea to human challenges. Since Jeffrey Sachs, the one would say promoter or initiator of that program, left the scene, kind of, it's been like neither here nor there. And now, 7 years to the end time of such a program, we are still barely 30% implementation in most places around the world. However, if you are to go backwards and do a kind of audit, you will be shocked to find that the resources so far expended on the SDGs far outstrips the achievements face to face if you put them together. Therefore, the question is, what happened? It means there is more leakage in the system than achievement.
On whose part?
Well, on the implementers. The states...
So are we talking about nation states?
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Nation states are supposed to be the actual implementers, because the United Nations is a policy body. It has no executive powers, and therefore sits down, create policies, convince nation states to say, do this, it will be better for everybody. States pick it up, go home, and begin to implement. Now, that is where the challenges begin to come in. Even when these programs are distracted, United Nations will only sit by and come maybe for review. And these reviews are just meetings. As soon as they leave, the nation continues on its own. So,
I was talking about it with Sunday earlier. I said,
Okay.
the United Nations cannot come into Nigeria and say, oh, President Tinubu, you're missing the target.
Yes.
We want you to do this. And that lack of authority itself makes the whole idea around the United Nations an ineffective one.
Precisely. Yeah. So we should not miss out or pretend ostrich in these matters. It needs to be known, because whether we like it or not, the United Nations belongs to us. We fund it as taxpayers.
That's right.
Right, because, I mean, if we go back and see how much Nigeria, for instance, pays to maintain the United Nations, we would have kept this money here to do some other things.
Isn't that something practical that we need to consider? Our financial obligation to the United
more
Nations.
like a cost-benefit analysis.
Yes, of course.
Exactly.
And that is not even factoring the high number of delegations that we transport every year to these meetings for only God knows what. I would like Ambassador Warkani to hold his thoughts there while we circle back to Kanu. Kanu is on the spotlight this morning, if you like, so that we can get an update from the tribunal where the Daily Trust Bureau Chief Oloyede Clement is standing by to give us updates. Welcome back, Clement.
Okay, I think we're going to need a moment to reconnect. Okay, yeah, Clement is back. Hello, Clement. Good morning once again.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
What is the latest?
Okay, the latest is still that we are still waiting inside the tribunal. Inside the tribunal premises, the door to the tribunal has not been opened, but all the parties are already gathered here, like I spoke to you earlier, and I had the Commissioner of Information, who is representing the NNPP. A few minutes after we spoke, the APC team came into the tribunal premises, and we are fortunate to have the former Commissioner of Justice, the Attorney General of Kano State, Barrister M.A. Lawan, who is told here. So,
you have less than 1 minute for this call.
Barrister.
Okay.
Oh my.
Perhaps somebody needs to top up, and then we'll get back to that call in just a moment. And hopefully we get that, sorted out as soon as possible, because we need to get the thoughts of the other side of that contest, which is the APC. As you can imagine, it's a very tense atmosphere. I mean, Kano is always tense, politically speaking, regardless of what time of the year it is. But there is a tribunal judgment to be delivered today in Kano State, and that in itself is adding fuel to the fire in the state. But so far, we've heard from the NNPP, and we're happy to have Clement back. So, Clement, please proceed with the former Commissioner of Justice.
Yes, I'm with the former Commissioner of Justice, Dr. M.A. Lawan. Barrister, the judgment day due today is the people.
Yeah.
What is the expectation of the APC for today?
Well, thank you very much. This thing started about 6 months ago, and of course, as you're well aware, our petition is against the NNPP, the election of the governor of Kano State, and we have about 3 grounds which we have argued extensively before the court. Of course, the respondents also responded. Our expectation today is that we have done enough. We have been able to convince the tribunal, and we expect judgment in our favor.
Right.
Any question for the boys?
So Clement, we would like the former commissioner to give us a sense of what he makes of the atmosphere in Kano, especially regarding this particular judgment.
Okay. The question from the studio, former commissioner, is that what is the position or what is the view of the APC as regards the atmosphere in Kano, as regards security? A lot of schools did not open today. A lot of people did not go to their place of work. What is the view of the APC as regards?
Well, one of the most important things that we protect is the security of the people of Kano State, and indeed Nigeria. It is unfortunate some of the statements that were made by some people, but that is very, very unfortunate. We do not expect that on a day like this, when the court is going to give judgment, that the people of Kano State should be apprehensive, afraid of the security. But I believe that all of us are first and foremost are supposed to be law-abiding. So I call on all the people of Kano State to please stay calm. Nothing is going to happen. Nothing is going to happen. And I tell you that the security agencies have taken all the necessary steps to ensure that the lives and property of the people of Kano State is protected.
I know the commissioner is...
Yeah, because we're about to enter into the tribunal, and we are just going to go in now. But we have just one more question that we'll let him go.
I think that will be fine. It is good you get in there and get us take vintage position.
All the gist.
Thank you very much, sir.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're about to be going to go in, and we'll keep update as we are going to do.
All right. We'll continue to keep touch base with you, and we hope that you keep yourself safe.
Okay.
All right, back to the studio where we have been looking at our participation at the United Nations General Assembly, the 78th in the series, and the issues that have been put on the table by the Nigeria's president. And just before we left, we talked about how over the years it does appear that the United Nations has become ineffective. But in your thoughts, what would then be the way forward? Because I mean, considering the experience of the world with the First and Second World War, it became imperative that we have to find a place where everybody comes to ventilate. But the problem is that we have been ventilating for too long, and it doesn't appear that it's enough to ventilate and leave it on the table. For Africa specifically, that seems to have taken very little out of this whole engagement. What's the way forward to us? Because even the African Union doesn't seem to be faring any better. I mean, we hear it does appear that there are nation states within Africa that are even louder than the African Union. There is supposed to be a common platform for us to advance Africa's cause. In fact, you have nations in Africa that would rather identify as Europeans than even identify as Africa. How do we begin to, what alternative platforms are there for us to drive the African agenda and by extension, the agendas of the sovereign states in Africa?
Well, the fundamental reasons for the formation of the United Nations being a response to the global war, which is commonly called the World Wars. Mankind, as of then, believed that by coming together to discuss issues generally would have lessened some of these problems. So the idea was preventive diplomacy. And that is the basis for the formation of the United Nations. Good. But unfortunately, this has not really worked as expected. Yes, the United Nations has created a platform for nations to come and discuss. Yes, it has even created an inner core called the United Nations Security Council, which is exclusive to some countries based on some undescribable reasons for being members. And yet, it did not simply solve any problem. Wars are still breaking out, which means the preventive aspect of diplomacy has failed. There wouldn't be Russia-Ukraine war today if the United Nations was what it should be. That is the key question. Second, when you see war situations and United Nations, for instance, is compelled to deploy a mission, usually it is called UN peacekeeping mission. Now, to keep the peace is different from enforcing the peace or creating the peace in the first place. Therefore, if the United Nations has peace missions, it presupposes that someone else must have worked to create the peace that you are coming to keep. Right. Even in conceptualization, there is something faulty, which means the Blue Berets, United Nations forces, should have been equipped with more potency to address issues on the ground. Because when you see United Nations missions in, let's say, Congo, Angola,
especially Congo.
Very good.
Especially Congo.
People are being killed beside the UN mission. The question is, what is the UN mission doing there?
Yeah, and
when you raise that controversy, without cutting you short, I was just following up on a report on Haiti on how the United Nations decided to treat children of UN workers left over in Haiti. And then after going to intervene in a problem, you create another set of problems, and you have no position whatsoever. You've made promises over several years, and you're finding 2017 was when the promise was made to them that their problem will be tackled, and as we speak,
the problem still persists.
The problem still persists, and they have no position on how to move forward. And so you have a people who are just left to their own fate, and the original problem you came to solve is still also subsisting.
In fact, more complicated by your presence.
Exactly.
Because when sometimes local populations that are totally impoverished or totally unsecured run to some of these missions. You see situations where the UN mission is incapable of protecting these vulnerable citizens. So the question is, there's need to go back to the drawing table and begin to fashion out programs and projects that will be maybe the opposite of what is going on right now. There has to be an admission of, okay, we have not succeeded or we have failed. We need a redesign of these programs.
Okay. Just before we wrap things up, this past week, the African Union, we're talking about platforms and alliances. The African Union got its permanent membership into the G20, which appears to be, celebrated across the continent as some sort of big headway in terms of getting a seat at the table. The African Union has always been an invited guest. So one of just two organizational blocks alongside the EU to join the G20. What does that mean for Africa, especially as the United Nations General Assembly continues to have this conversation around this new world order, where Africa is still yet to get a seat at the United Nations Security Council? I mean, in spite of all the security challenges that Africa is facing, it doesn't even have a seat at the table to discuss security.
Well, Africa having a seat at the UN Security Council might not really come easily. It might not come. And even if it does come, perhaps translating...
I mean, but it is a no-brainer, Ambassador, isn't it?
Yeah, well, even when you have, it does not necessarily translate into action. Because we have seen members of the Security Council themselves being confronted and at disagreements or even sometimes open war between themselves, which means including the veto powers as exercised by some countries, it does not just work. And that's why we are saying ordinarily the United Nations itself needed to be revisited and some of these things taken aback and remodeled so that it can be more effective and less expensive. Because the problem here is, sincerely, running the United Nations, if you watch very carefully, you will see that it is one of the most expensive endeavors in this world. And just opposed with the achievements, it leaves a gap. And therefore...
There's no value for money.
No, certainly.
Right. I mean, some would say a diplomat is saying that. I mean, how can you counter that argument?
And how plain can it be? I think it's time that, as he has said, that every nation goes back and listening to itself and it takes does an introspection of its participation. There are one or two countries who are not interested in this talk show, and it has not changed anything. It has not changed anything. And so the question is, we are not there. We are not missing out on anything. What's the prize? What's the benefit of being there? I think that's another contemplation for world leaders, including our own, who has been there or who is there and who has made his maiden speech alongside several other events.
Maybe sincerely, if I must say, the benefit of attending this hunger, like others before, and many more that will come, is what happens at the fringes.
The side events.
More than what happens.
Yes, more than what happens at the 15 minutes speech. Right now, our president has been talking to, let's say, the world president of ExxonMobil.
That's right.
Right? Okay.
You'll be talking to Joe Biden somewhere in between.
Very good. These are going to bring investments into the country. Now, Nigeria particularly, you recall, the last 8 years of the previous administration was like almost a disaster. Because when the president came, I recall vividly when he was referring to the Niger Delta people, I mean the militants particularly, and said he was going to crush them. And the militant says, okay, we will wait, we will crush you. They crushed the president and his administration because, don't forget, oil production in Nigeria dropped from 3.6 million barrels a day to literally 500,000 barrels.
From self-sabotage.
Very good.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So now, these are some of the real issues. And so I think the investment is more for us what happens at the fringes than what happens at the floor of the United Nations.
We're going to have to leave it here for now, Ambassador Warkani. As always, thank you for your invaluable insight and analysis on this very important talking point. We'll circle back hopefully when the whole General Assembly wraps up, so we can perhaps do an analysis of some of the takeaways from this 17th
cost-benefit analysis.
Exactly.